North of Lincolnshire's fenland edge are remnants of what was once a much more extensive area of sandy open heathland, known locally as Coversands. Lowland Heath is a rare habitat, only found in small areas of Europe and parts of Scandinavia. But what makes it so special is that it's not really a naturally formed habitat at all. In fact, it's been created and sustained by human activity over the past 10,000 years. Typically, the heathland we see today is an open landscape with a thin covering of heather, coarse grasses and a few low-growing shrubs. There are some areas of bare sand and others of boggy marsh, and together they go to make up one of the most important and beautiful wildlife habitats in the country. The poor acidic sandy soils that support the typical heathland plants are formed on clays and soils left behind after the ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age. The Earth's temperature fluctuates constantly, and in the past we were subjected to a series of bitterly cold spells or ice ages. The last one started 80,000 years ago, when huge sheets of ice over a kilometre thick spread down from the north, covering much of Britain. As they slowly moved forward, these glaciers acted like gigantic sheets of sandpaper, scouring the rocks as they travelled over them and trapping millions of tons of soil and rubble in the ice. When they finally began to melt, great heaps of the soil and rock that had been dragged along in the glacier were left scattered over much of Lincolnshire. Although the ice was melting, conditions remained bitterly cold for thousands of years, and Lincolnshire was still bleak, with freezing winds whipping across the bare landscape. A tongue of ice blocked rivers draining out into the North Sea through the Humber Gap, and a vast shallow lake formed, covering an area from present-day York almost down to Boston in the south. Geologists have called this Lake Humber, and it only drained away 12,000 years ago, when the ice that was damming it finally melted. During the ice ages, rivers, water melting from the glaciers, and finally the huge lake had all deposited millions of tons of sand and gravel. The strong westerly winds at the end of the ice age whipped up this sand, blowing it over the soils and clay dumped from the retreating glaciers to create the areas we call Coversands. 10,000 years ago, Lincolnshire was a cold tundra landscape like Siberia or Alaska today. But around that time, archaeologists find evidence of the first groups of people moving back into Lincolnshire as the ice sheets retreated.
Lincolnshire's Lowland Heath sites are really important for our study of archaeology, as they form a continuous record for human activity around here over the millennia. The record starts with finds of worked flints that have been picked up on the sandy sites. These show that hunter-gatherer groups working along the edge of the ice sheet at the end of the last ice age were coming into this area, walking across what's now the North Sea, as they migrated in here from Europe following the herds.
The climate was improving slowly, but even though the ice was retreating, much of the sea's water was still frozen in the ice sheets to the north, and sea levels were much lower than today.
At the end of the last ice age, what's now the bed of the North Sea was an enormous plain with hills and valleys and rivers in it. But as the ice sheets melted, water was released and sea level rose, engulfing this plain, covering everything up until around 6,500 BC, the Straits of Dover were broken through and we became the island that we are today.
The climate was slowly improving all the time, and by 8000 BC, a scrub woodland began to replace the tundra.
You might think with the end of the ice age that things would be better for people with it getting warmer, but this alas wasn't the case. Forests began to spread all over the landscape. This had two effects. One was it made animals more difficult to catch in the woodland. The other thing was that woodland supports far fewer animals than open tundra. See, all the food is growing up in the air on the tops of the trees where animals can't get at it. Because of this, people had to adopt new strategies in order to catch their food.
By 7000 BC, the Mesolithic hunters had set about creating clearances in the woodland to attract game. and by around 5000 BC, a lot of the natural woodland had already been cleared.
Well, the hunters had it all their own way until about 4500 BC, when a new idea was introduced into this country from the continent. This was agriculture. New people came over, bringing with them cattle, sheep and goats, and they also started to farm. The woodlands were cleared to allow for cultivation and cereals to be grown. Along with agriculture, they brought in some new types of tools. They brought in pottery, and they brought in objects like this polished stone axe that they would have used in the clearing of the woodland.
Over the next 2,000 years, farming really takes a hold in the country, and once people settled down and began living in small villages, then great areas of the woodland were cleared for farmland. New ideas of religion and technology came into the country through trade with Europe, and around 2500 BC, a new group of immigrants, the Beaker people, brought in bronze working.
This type of axe is associated with what we call Beaker Pottery. This is a beaker, a type of pot that occurs throughout Europe. It's these pots spread like wildfire, possibly being carried across with a new practice called drinking beer that caused them to spread. In England, these pots are almost all found in graves, but we've got an important exception round here where we're getting lots of pieces of Beaker pottery like this being found on our open heathland sites. These are settlements, which for England is very interesting, very exciting. Along with the pieces of pottery, we're getting lots of objects made of flint, things like arrowheads and scrapers, which are characteristic of the Beaker people.
Over thousands of years, clearance and constant farming had begun to deplete the light, sandy soils of important nutrients. And when the climate suddenly got worse around 1000 BC, the change towards heathland became inevitable.
These soils were never very good, but they were light and easily cultivated and attracted settlement from a very early date. By about 2000 BC, all of this would have been cleared. There would have been small fields being cultivated. Stock would be kept in enclosures, but the weak soils really couldn't stand it. By about 1000 BC, problems were already beginning to set in, and around 1000 BC, the weather got worse. There was a climatic change. It got colder, there was increased rainfall, and lands like this, already a bit marginal, were knocked out of use.
Climate plays a crucial part in the formation of heathland, and the British climate is ideal, cool with a regular and reasonably high rainfall. As the rain soaks down through these light sandy soils, it washes out all the important minerals and clay particles in a process that we call leaching. And what's left behind is a poor acidic soil known as a podzol. Often the washed out minerals are deposited in a concentrated band where the water table occurs, and in some cases, if the layer is rich in iron, it forms a hard impervious band known as iron pan. This then prevents proper drainage, and the soil above becomes waterlogged and boggy. Only a few species of plants are adapted to thrive in these harsh conditions, and species such as heather, gorse and coarse grasses take over to create the classic heathland habitat that we know today. Throughout the Iron Age, as the soils became harder to farm, so population began to decline.
The object I've got here is a good marker of what happened next. It's an iron currency bar, an imitation sword used as money in the Iron Age. Now, iron was introduced into this country probably around the 6th century BC, by which time the heathlands were very marginal land, perhaps used for a bit of pasture but not much else. But the leaching that had carried on, the washing out of iron to form iron pan, produced a very good and easily smelted iron ore, and it was being worked at places like Manton Warren to produce iron to make things like this imitation sword.
When the Romans arrived in 57 AD, they made little use of the poor acid soils of the heathland, preferring the better chalk soils to the north and east. Over the next 1000 years, the picture remains the same. Whilst the leached out sandy soil was poor agricultural land, it was put to other uses by the Saxons, who dug cemeteries at sites like Manton Warren and Tattershall Thorpe. When William the Conqueror invaded in 1066, he split up all the land between himself, the church and a few rich barons who'd supported him. The vast majority of people were poor peasant farmers who weren't allowed to own land of their own. But importantly, they were given special common law rights over woodland and the large open heaths, where they were allowed to graze their animals and collect wood and bracken for fuel. It was this low-level grazing activity that allowed plants like heather and gorse to flourish, shaping the distinctive character of the heathland we see today. And by the 17th century, there were vast areas of open heathland throughout the country.
Throughout the medieval period, people tried to scratch a living along the edges of heathlands. Here, to the north of Scunthorpe, we've got a line of deserted medieval villages, marginal and now long abandoned. Behind me is all that's left of the village of High Risby, the remains of its church. It was common land where they could graze a few animals. It was somewhere where they could go out and cut turf and gather firewood. And it was the activities of these poor peasants and their animals that preserved this unique environment and prevented it from becoming overgrown with trees.
Heathland was crucial to our ancestors' survival, but over the years more and more land was fenced off for private use. In 1740, Parliament passed the Enclosures Act, preventing access rights to common land like heaths, and between 1767 and 1867, 7 million acres were fenced in. Thousands died of starvation, and millions of people left the countryside forever to work in the new factories and mines in the industrial towns. With these changes in the countryside and without constant management by man, heathland very quickly reverts to its original state and gets overrun by tree scrub and bracken. In the 20th century, large areas were ploughed up or planted with pine forest, and with the expansion of urban areas, we've lost nearly 90% of all the heathland we had 200 years ago. These beautiful landscapes are associated with human activity since our earliest history, and not only are they a rare and valuable habitat for wildlife, they have a huge cultural and historical significance.